Let's spend a little time with Beaumarchais and with his play, Le Mariage du Figaro. In order to do that, I've invited Cynthia Stokes, stage director, arts educator, and she happens to be the curriculum specialist for San Diego Opera. Cynthia, welcome.
Thank you.
Good to have you here. And good friend, I might add. Tell us a little bit about the play itself, the Beaumarchais play. How was it accepted when it was first produced and first written?
Well, one of the things that I think is remarkable about the play and also about Beaumarchais' life was that really the plays themselves and Figaro himself really are a footprint of Beaumarchais' own life. And Beaumarchais was in and out of trouble, made and lost fortune after fortune after fortune, and was censored and put in jail and really seemed to manage to live sort of on both sides of keeping the aristocracy happy and yet really being a man of the people. What happened when Figaro was first conceived, Barber of Seville had ultimately been a huge success. And mobs of people came out of the theater and screamed at his door to congratulate him. And so, of course, then everyone wanted a sequel. This is the story always. And a number of people in the aristocracy actually approached him to say, well, what else can we do with this Figaro? And so the beginnings of that started to gestate right after Barber of Seville was initially thought of. Also, Beaumarchais was always interested, actually, in the operatic possibilities of Figaro. And so you'll see, even in the play itself, there's quite a bit of music.
Well, there's lots of music. There are lots of songs.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was his nod of sort of, it's a play, it's an opera, it's a play
and I think
with music.
even Barber was presented to an opera company as a libretto first.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
So he always had that in mind. So he writes a draft of it, and of course there are all these censors. And the play is soundly refused because it questions the role of aristocracy and about what a count may or may not do.
Now, this is the big thing that that I don't think contemporary audiences really understand, because we don't live in that kind of a monarchy.
Right.
We live in a democracy here in the United States, and the marriage of Figaro was considered terribly revolutionary and very threatening.
In so many ways. First off, because it questioned the right of whoever the signor was to ravage a woman on the day of her marriage. The other thing that I think is particularly revolutionary about it is the fact that the count in the course of the play and in the opera is really soundly taken down by his servants and his wife. One of the things that I think is so interesting about this piece is that really the women, who at that time were considered property, are very much the ones that move the story forward. They're the ones that plot. I mean, Figaro comes in and out, but we see in this piece, too, that Figaro's master is love. And the women are really the ones who are wiser and continue to forgive, but really see sort of beyond just the day-to-day of things. So the whole question of whether this whether the count is allowed to ravage Susanna, who is Figaro's bride-to-be. And at the time, this was something that was considered just done.
Well, I think by that point, at least by the time of the late 18th century, this ravaging, the droit du seigneur is what they called it, wasn't active anymore. And I think perhaps that's one of the things that horrified audiences as well, that itself was considered still.
But even beyond that, it was a metaphor for all of the other things that were allowed for the aristocracy. So even though that was just a comic example, it really heightened that division between the people who had versus the people who had not, and really just by virtue of the fact that you happen to be born into a family of wealth versus being born into peasants or serfs made you or gave you access to all sorts of rights that you didn't have as a common man.
Now, I've always been interested in the fact that these are essentially commedia characters.
Right.
I mean, you can really smell the connection between commedia dell'arte and some of these characters, and that is a major difference.
Right, especially with the secondary characters. I mean, if you look at Basilio and you look at Bartolo and
Marcellina.
Absolutely. Well, she changes, which is so interesting, because she really starts off as this grotesque, this kind of old hag, and over the course of the story, she really becomes this wise woman, this kind of amazing mother figure who has great vision and warns her son, what about jealousy? And, oh, I'm above that, and of course, he isn't.
Yeah. The interesting thing, though, is, of course, that in Commedia, although the servant is always outwitting his master, the master is never a nobleman.
Right.
And that's the big difference with the Beaumarchais.
Exactly, exactly. But it's interesting that, you know, if you could also say the Count's behavior is not noble, and so that sort of evens the playing field.
And that's the very reason that Joseph II ultimately accepted this play being done as an opera by Mozart and Da Ponte.
So what happens? So Beaumarchais writes this, and it goes through one censor, and absolutely not. And he petitions the king, and they get a second censor and a third censor, all 6 censors, I think, totally. And the king keeps saying, absolutely not. We're not going to do this play. But he does allow Beaumarchais to do readings of the piece himself, which, of course, because Beaumarchais was such a performer in his own way, he would, for a fee, come and quietly read the play to a salon of people. In fact, the Queen of Russia even invited him to come and read Figaro for her.
Fascinating.
Very interesting.
So it got around.
It certainly did. It certainly did.
Okay.
Ultimately, I think it was about 5 years before the Revolution, the piece was finally done. There had been, you know, attempts before that, sort of secret productions the king or somebody would find out about and then shut down. I actually think I remember there was a Comédie Française production that on the day of the show was discovered and was canceled. So it really had a hard time and really was not performed that much, but it was certainly in kind of a sub rosa way known by everyone who was anyone that this was very interesting and also, you know, inflammatory.
Cynthia, thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure.